She almost didn't get out of the truck. Laurel Voss sat in the driveway of a place she'd never been, staring at a house she'd just legally inherited, and thought, this was a mistake. The engine was still running. She could put it in reverse, drive back to the highway, and pretend the letter from the attorney had gotten lost in the mail, like everything else in her life lately. But the house was looking at her. That's what it felt like. The two front windows catching the late afternoon sun in a way that made them glow orange, like eyes, like it was waiting to see what she'd do. She turned off the engine. The house belonged to her great-uncle Clement, who had died 6 weeks ago at the age of 81, alone, on a cattle ranch in Harlan County, Texas. Laurel had met the man exactly twice, once at a funeral when she was 9, once at a Christmas gathering when she was 14. She remembered a tall man with a white mustache who smelled like cedar and gave her a $20 bill without saying much. She hadn't thought about him in years. Then the letter came. You are the sole heir to the Clement Voss estate, including approximately 1,400 acres of ranch land, livestock outbuildings, and the primary residence located at Rural Route 7. She'd read it 4 times. Then she'd called the attorney, a man named Gerald Pruitt in Abilene, who confirmed it in a flat, unsurprised voice, as if people inherited cattle ranches they knew nothing about every day. Your uncle had no children, Gerald had said. He revised his will 3 years ago. He wanted the land to stay in the family. Laurel was an architect. She lived in a 740-square-foot apartment in Austin. She had a drafting table, a collection of succulents she kept forgetting to water, and an ex-boyfriend who'd recently moved to Portland with her best friend. She did not know anything about cattle. But she was 28 years old and she had nothing, tying her to Austin anymore. So she packed what she could fit in her truck and drove west. The front door was unlocked. Inside smelled like old wood and coffee and something she couldn't name, something animal and warm and not unpleasant. The kitchen had a cast iron skillet on the stove. There was a calendar on the wall, still turned to March, a pair of boots by the door, worn down at the heels, size 12. She touched the edge of one boot and then pulled her hand back, feeling like an intruder. She was still standing in the kitchen when she heard the truck. It pulled up slow, a dark blue pickup that had seen better years, and the man who got out moved like someone who'd been working since before sunrise and planned to keep going until well after dark. He was tall, taller than she'd expected, broad-shouldered, with the kind of tan that comes from years outdoors and not a single afternoon at a pool. He wore a gray shirt with the sleeves pushed up and a worn leather belt, and he was already looking at the house with an expression she couldn't read. Then he saw her truck. He stopped walking. She stepped out onto the porch, and they looked at each other across 20 feet of gravel driveway, and neither of them said anything for a moment that stretched too long. You must be the niece, he said finally. Not a question. Great niece, she said. Laurel Voss, he nodded slowly like he was processing that. Declan Marsh, you work here? Something moved across his face. Not quite a fence, but close. I manage this ranch, have for 6 years. She understood then. He'd known Clement. He'd been here every day, probably, while her great-uncle aged alone in this house. And now a stranger had driven up in a city truck with Austin plates and was standing on the porch like she owned the place. Which she did, and they both knew it. I didn't know about you, she said. The attorney didn't mention a ranch manager. No, Declan said. He wouldn't. He looked at the door behind her. I need to check on the water line on the north pasture before dark. You need anything before I go? She wanted to say, I need you to explain everything to me. I need to know what this place costs to run, and what the cattle situation is, and why my great-uncle left this to someone he barely knew. What she said was, I'm fine, thank you. He nodded again and got back in his truck. She stood on the porch and watched him drive away toward the far end of the property and thought, this is going to be complicated. She didn't sleep well the first night. The house made sounds she wasn't used to. The creak of settling wood, the wind off the plains coming through the gap under the back door. Something that might have been cattle lowing in the far dark. She lay in the bed that had been her great-uncle's and stared at the ceiling and tried to understand what she was doing here. In the morning, she found a piece of notebook paper on the kitchen table. Water line is fixed. North pasture cattle count is 47. Feed delivery Thursday. DM. She read it twice. Then she put the coffee on and sat down at the kitchen table with her phone and started looking up what it meant to run a cattle operation in Texas. She was still reading 2 hours later when Declan's truck pulled up again. He knocked. She noticed that. He knocked before walking in, even though this had been his daily workplace for 6 years. She opened the door, and he looked at the phone in her hand and the notes she'd been scribbling, and something shifted slightly in his expression. Not warmer, exactly, but less guarded. "Gerald Pruitt will be here at 2, he said, to go over the ranch finances with you." She hadn't known that. "Did he call you?" "He called me because I'm listed as the operating contact for the ranch accounts." "Of course, I see. Thank you." He started to turn. Declan. She'd used his name without thinking, and she saw him notice it. I know this situation is strange. I'm not here to blow everything up. I just need to understand what I've inherited before I make any decisions." He turned back. His eyes were dark, a brown so deep it was almost black, and he looked at her for a long moment the way someone looks at something they haven't decided about yet. "The ranch runs on thin margins," he said. "It always has." Clement knew what he was doing, kept it going through 3 droughts, and a downturn that broke most of his neighbors. The land is good. The cattle are healthy. The equipment needs work. He paused. "It's worth keeping. I believe you," she said. That seemed to surprise him. He left without saying anything else. Gerald Pruitt was a small, careful man who spoke in the measured rhythm of someone long accustomed to delivering complicated news to people who weren't prepared for it. He spread the ranch finances across the kitchen table like a card hand and walked Laurel through each piece. The operating accounts, the outstanding loan on the equipment, the grazing lease on the adjacent acreage, the property tax assessment. The loan was the problem. Clement had taken it out 18 months before he died to replace a tractor and repair the main barn. It was due in full in 4 months. "How much?" Laurel asked. Gerald told her. She kept her face still. It was the amount she'd spent 6 years saving toward a down payment on a condo in Austin. The condo she'd never bought because she'd kept believing the right moment was coming. "And if it's not paid?" "The bank holds the barn and the equipment as collateral. Without those, you can't run cattle efficiently on this scale. You'd have to sell down the herd. Most operators in that position end up selling the land within a year." Gerald folded his hands. "I want to be honest with you, Miss Voss. Your uncle knew this when he changed his will. I believe he hoped that whoever inherited would find a way. But it is a significant challenge." After Gerald left, she sat at the table for a long time. Declan came in at 6 without knocking this time, which she took as a sign of something, and found her still at the table. He looked at the papers. He looked at her. "You know about the loan," he said. "I know about the loan." He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down, which surprised her. He hadn't sat in her presence before. He rested his forearms on the table and looked at the papers the way you look at a problem you've been thinking about for a long time. "I have an idea," he said, "but you're not going to like it." She almost smiled. "Try me. There's a conservation easement program through the state. Ranchers give up development rights on their land in exchange for a cash payment. The land stays a ranch. You just can't ever subdivide or build on it. The payment would cover the loan." He looked up. Clement wouldn't do it. He thought it was giving something away. "But you're not Clement." She thought about it. "That's permanent." "Yes. You'd still have a job. That's not why I'm suggesting it." She believed him, somehow. "I'll look into it." He nodded and started to get up. "Why did he leave it to me?" she asked. "Do you know?" Declan was quiet for a moment. "He talked about you sometimes. Said you were the only one in the family who ever wrote him a letter." She didn't remember writing a letter. Then she did. A thank you note for the $20 when she was 14. Her mother had made her do it. Clement had kept it. She found it 3 days later, tucked inside the family Bible in the bedroom. She stayed. She told herself it was temporary. She'd sort out the loan, stabilize the ranch, then decide. But the days had a way of filling themselves. She drove the pastures with Declan in the mornings, learning the names of things she'd never known. Heifer, steer, the difference between coastal Bermuda and native bluestem. He was patient in the way of someone who'd taught himself everything he knew and understood what that was like. He didn't talk much. When he did, it mattered. "You're not what I expected," he said one morning, and she didn't ask what he'd expected. She had a feeling she knew. She filed the easement application. She spoke twice with the state land office, and once with a program officer named Patricia, who told her the processing time was 6 to 8 weeks. The loan was due in 13. "That's tight," Laurel said. "It is," Patricia agreed. She didn't tell Declan that part. She didn't know why. What she knew was that she'd started waking up with the light, which she'd never done in Austin, and that the coffee tasted different here, better, maybe, or just more necessary. She knew that the cattle had names, the ones Declan's part-time helper Boyd had given them years ago, and that she'd memorized most of them without meaning to. She knew that when Declan laughed, which was rare, it changed his whole face into something younger and easier, and she'd caught herself trying to make it happen again. She also knew there was something wrong. It started with small things. A fence line on the east boundary that she found cut, not broken. The wire sheared clean, the kind of cut that needed tools. A gate left open on the road pasture, twice, that neither she nor Declan had opened. Boyd, who showed up 3 days a week, swore it wasn't him. Then Declan found tire tracks in the south pasture that didn't match any vehicle on the property. "Who owns the land east of us?" she asked. Declan's jaw tightened. "A man named Ray Coulter. He's been trying to buy this ranch for 4 years. Clement turned him down every time. He wants the land. He wants the aquifer under it. There's a water rights battle in this county that's been going on for a decade. This land sits over one of the cleanest private water sources in the region. Clement knew it. That's why he never sold." She thought about the easement application, which would make the land permanently undevelopable and remove any incentive for Coulter to acquire it. She thought about the timing. The loan due in 13 weeks, the application taking 6 to 8. "What happens if we can't make the loan payment and we have to sell the herd?" she asked. "We'd list the ranch within 6 months," he said, "probably, and Coulter would buy it." Declan didn't answer, which was its own answer. That night she lay in the dark and thought about a man she'd never met cutting her fence lines. She thought about her great-uncle, alone in this house for the last years of his life, holding the line against something Laurel was only now beginning to understand. She thought about a thank-you note that a 14-year-old girl had written because her mother told her to, and an old man who'd kept it for 14 years in the family Bible. She thought, "I'm not selling this land." The call came on a Tuesday late morning, while she helped Declan repair the gate on the road pasture. Her phone buzzed and she looked at it and saw Gerald Pruitt's name. She stepped away to answer it. Gerald said, "Miss Voss, I've just received a call from Harlan County First National. They've been approached by a buyer who's offered to pay off your uncle's loan in full, in exchange for a first right of purchase on the property, should you ever decide to sell or default." Her stomach dropped. "Coulter, I can't confirm the buyer's identity, but..." He paused. "It is worth knowing that this offer came in this week, and not before." After she hung up, she stood at the fence and looked at the road and thought about how well-timed that was. The easement application was in. If it was approved before the loan was due, Coulter lost his window. If he could make the bank nervous enough to call the loan early, or if he could create enough problems with the fence lines and the gate to run her off first, he might get what he wanted before the application processed. She walked back to where Declan was working the gate hinge. She told him everything. He listened without interrupting, which she'd learned was how he listened to things that mattered. When she finished, he said, "You should know the bank manager's name is Victor Aldine. He and Coulter went to high school together." She stared at him. "You've known this. I knew some of it, not all. Not the offer to pay the loan Declan Clement knew too. He didn't tell me everything either." He looked at her with those dark eyes. He was a private man. "I'm not Clement," she said. "No," he said, "you're not." There was something in the way he said it. Not a compliment, exactly. Or not only that. Something more careful and more certain. She called an attorney in Abilene that afternoon. Not Gerald, but a woman named Suzanne Tate, who Gerald had recommended for exactly this kind of situation. Suzanne listened and then said, in a voice that made Laurel feel better immediately, "If that bank calls your loan early without contractual justification, we'll have a very interesting conversation with the State Banking Commission. Is there contractual justification? Let me read your documents." Suzanne called back the next morning. "No," she said, "there isn't. You're current on payments. They have no legal basis to accelerate. If they try, we respond within 24 hours. A pause. "Also, those fence cuts are criminal mischief under Texas law. Do you have any evidence?" Laurel thought of the tire tracks Declan had photographed on his phone without being asked. "Yes," she said. She filed the complaint with the county sheriff that afternoon. Declan drove her. He didn't say much on the way there or on the way back, But when they pulled back into the driveway and she sat for a moment without moving, he said, "You handled that well." Coming from him, it felt like something significant. "I'm terrified," she said. She hadn't meant to say it out loud. He looked at her. "I know," he said. "You're doing it anyway." The easement application came back in 5 weeks, not 8. Patricia from the land office called on a Thursday morning and said the application had been expedited because the property qualified under a water resources protection priority. The payment would be processed within 30 days, well before the loan was due. Laurel sat down on the porch steps with her phone in her hand after she hung up and felt the kind of relief that makes you realize how tightly you've been holding yourself together. Declan found her there when he came around the side of the house. He stopped when he saw her face. "Good news." "The easement," she said. "It's approved." He was quiet for a moment. She watched something move through him. Not surprise exactly, but something loosening. Like he'd been braced for a different outcome for a long time and hadn't known how to stop bracing. "Clement would be glad," he said. She thought about the old man. The boots by the door. The calendar still on March. The $20 bill and the letter she'd written at 14 that had apparently changed everything. "Did he know he was sick?" she asked. "When he changed the will." "Yes," Declan said. "He knew." "And he picked me," he said. Declan stopped. Started again. "He said you were someone who would understand that some things are worth more than what you can get for them." She looked out at the pasture. 47 cattle moving slow in the late morning heat. The barn her great-uncle had repaired. The grass coming in green where last month it had been dry. She thought about what it cost to understand that. The apartment she wasn't going back to. The drafting table she'd sold before she drove west. The life she'd had that had felt for a long time like it belonged to someone else. He was right, she said. Declan sat down on the step beside her. They weren't touching. There was a foot of space between them and the whole wide Texas sky above. But something was different from that first afternoon in the driveway. The two of them on opposite sides of 20 feet of gravel, sizing each other up. "I owe you an apology," he said. She looked at him. "For what?" "For being." He seemed to search for the right word. "Unwelcoming. When you first arrived, you were protecting something you'd spent 6 years building. That's not an excuse." "No," she agreed, "but it's a reason. There's a difference." He looked at her then. Really looked at her, the way he hadn't in those first days. The way someone looks when they've stopped making up their mind about something and the decision is already made. "I'd like to keep working here," he said. "If that's—" "Of course it is," she said. "This ranch doesn't work without you. I know that now." He nodded, and she thought that was going to be the end of it. But he said, "It doesn't work without you either, not anymore." She didn't say anything. She wasn't sure she could. They told Victor Aldine about the easement payment in a brief, factual letter from Suzanne Tate. They sent a copy to the State Banking Commission, which seemed, from Suzanne's tone, like an appropriate precaution. Ray Coulter, who Laurel had still never met face-to-face, bought a property 2 counties over that spring. She didn't know if the sheriff's complaint had anything to do with it. She didn't ask. Boyd fixed the east fence line properly, and they put a camera on the road gate. No one bothered it again. The feed delivery came. The cattle gained weight through spring. The barn roof, which had been borderline, got patched on a clear April Saturday when Declan and Boyd, and a rancher from down the road named Cliff, came and made a day of it. Laurel handed up materials and made lunch, and by evening there was a barn roof that would last another 10 years, and 4 people sitting on the tailgate of Declan's truck eating brisket from a place in town called Hattie's. "You staying?" Cliff asked her. She looked at the house with the windows catching the last of the sun, orange and warm. "I'm staying," she said. She felt Declan's shoulder against hers. They were sitting that close on the tailgate, and she felt him relax in a way she recognized now. The way he relaxed when something he'd been worrying about was resolved. She hadn't known, 3 months ago, that she could learn to read a person this well. She hadn't known she could learn to read a land either. The color of the grass in the morning, the way the cattle moved when rain was coming, the sound the windmill made when the wind was from the north. She hadn't known that a $20 bill and a thank you note could be the beginning of a life she'd been looking for without knowing what she was looking for. She hadn't known a lot of things. She was still learning. That was all right. She had time. She had 1,400 acres and 47 cattle, and a barn with a new roof, and a man sitting beside her on a tailgate who looked at her sometimes like she was the most surprising thing that had ever happened to him. And she thought that maybe, for the first time in a long time, she was exactly where she was supposed to be.